Well, it seems that we are okay. Perfect. We are live. Well, good afternoon, evening, morning to everyone. My name is Claudio Coletta. I work as a senior assistant professor at the University of Bologna, and I will be chairing this closing plenary session this evening. And first of all, let me say thanks to the conference organizers for this wonderful opportunity. I am very honored this evening to introduce you to internationally renowned keynote speakers in this joint plenary, Professor Ayona Datta and Professor Rob Kitchin, as their work has been and continue to be so important and inspiring for many of us in many fields, from geography to sociology, from planning to software and critical data studies, and you name it. Their scientific contributions represent a fundamental compass to orient ourselves between the digital and the urban, and more particularly within the vague terrain of smart cities, allowing us to move back and forth from the margins to the center of power and calculation across the networked infrastructures, being at the same time critical and engaged, and able to make an impact on the phenomena we study as well. The rationale of this joint plenary intends thus to critically unfold the issue of sensing the city as the main topic of the RC21 Conference from different and interconnected angles. Sensing networks and data infrastructures connect, in fact, with the sensing and political capacity of human bodies, mutually shaping social relations, values, and aspirations, ordering everyday aspects of urban life as well as institutional and management processes, ultimately defining being citizens or not. In scientific terms, sensing is thus making sense of a socio-technical assemblage where the digital dimension seems both overwhelming and obscuring inclusion and justice, and at the same time could bring waves of emancipatory potential. The core of this plenary is then scientific and political, in the extent that it intends to question our perspective, the eye through which we look at these urban and digital phenomena, and also the ears through which we listen to the voices of the field. The aim is to enhance our research senses and to shed light on the mechanism of discrimination nested in smart urban infrastructures, to address how ideas of social justice are formed within the same infrastructures and how could be pursued. Before starting, just a few housekeeping notes. The keynote will last about 30 minutes each. They will be recorded and put on the conference website afterwards, including questions. We would reserve the question and answer session at the end of the two talks in order to make them resonate among the audience. But I was just saying, if you have a very compelling specific question at the end of each talk, you are welcome to click on the button on the left of your interface and ask your question, or you can keep it in mind for the end. I would appreciate anyway if you could be able to make the question with your own voice and video activated, but we will keep an eye, of course, to the chat and read the question for you, if you prefer. Last but not least, after the plenary, the chair of the conference, Professor Sten Osterling, and RC21 president, Professor Talia Blokland, will give the closing address and the announcement for the next RC21 conference, so stay tuned. Now, it is a huge pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker, Ayona Datta, professor in human geography in University College London. Her research work focuses on the politics of urban transformations in the Global South, with a particular focus on gender and citizenship. For her contributions to the understanding of smart cities, Professor Datta received the Basque Medal from Royal Geographical Society in 2019. Professor Datta has coordinated several larger research projects funded by Swiss National Science Foundation, ESRC, AHRC, and British Academy. And in 2020, she received a European Research Council Advanced Grant Award for the project called Regional Futures to conduct investigation on the transition to automated planning processes in metropolitan region, particularly the Global South, and its impacts on regional urbanization. Among her several publications, Professor Datta is the author of The Illegal City, Space, Law and Gender in a Delhi Squatter Settlement, and co-editor of Mega Urbanization in the Global South, Fast Cities and Urban Utopias of the Post-Colonial State, and also Translocal Geographies, Spaces, Places and Connection. Finally, Professor Datta has a blog called The City Inside Out, a blog on gender, citizenship and urban life, a title that wonderfully summarize her scholarly commitment, where you can find many content related to her research, talks, writing, teaching, and great food for thought. Her keynote talk today is entitled Our Stories, Our Voices, a feminist toolkit for decolonizing the digital and urban margins. Ayona, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you, RC21, for inviting me to do this talk. Let me now find my slides. Can you see them? Yes, okay. So yeah, it's today my talk is called Our Stories, Our Voices, a feminist toolkit for decolonizing the digital and urban margins. And I want to start from what in recent years has been called a decolonial turn, where geographers have drawn, several geographers have drawn on Latin American, indigenous, and Black authors. And the geographical writing in recent years is now reorienting towards including plural and multitudinal voices and experiences of those that have been left behind by projects of colonialism, modernity, capitalism, among many others. And I want to start with this particular quote by Sarah Radcliffe, who notes that, quote, decoloniality seeks to re-theorize and remake the world by learning from multiple and varied spaces, times, and ontologies that provide non-universal and non-Eurocentric perspectives and dismantle world-making colonial modern relationships. But if decolonization is pushed back against the ontological biases of Western knowledge, there's also a growing sense that it is increasingly unclear as to how to actually decolonize. What are the inherent practices and pathways through which our knowledge and actions may become more diverse and plural in ways of knowing and doing? This is particularly pertinent given that we're all living in a digital urban age and that colonization is apparent not only across material, social, cultural, political places, but also increasingly across digital and analog boundaries. So as we are simultaneously becoming conscious of the imperative to decolonize knowledge and action, we have, however, paid less attention to the simultaneous marginalization brought forth by processes of digitalization at all scales. Now, this is just going round and round, and I'm not sure what's going on. Yeah. Okay, it's just taking ages to upload the next slide. So my talk today explores the pathways to decolonization through collaboration and co-production with young women who lived in a resettlement colony in Delhi's urban periphery. So we're back to Delhi after the first day's keynote with Ashameen. And I put this map of Delhi here just to show what the periphery means over here. And the purple dots are the eviction sites. And this is a map, I would say, around the 2004, 2005. There have been several evictions and new resettlement colonies since then. And the red squares are the resettlement sites. And you can really see geographically it is the periphery. And our work was around these two areas in Madanpur Khadar and Molaband, which is towards the southeastern periphery, side of the periphery. And the work was involved with these young women in resettlement colonies, but I want to start with saying resettlement colonies are not slums. They are authorized housing provided by the state to rehabilitate slum dwellers that have been evicted from the city. These are, however, invisible in the social and geographical imaginaries of the city, in a context where an increasingly technocratic city is being mapped and surveilled extensively through CCTV, drones, satellites, GIS mapping, etc. So information about these resettlement colonies are absent in most public records, and scant references to resettlement colonies are only found in the context of the media with references to crime and deviance. So I'm arguing today that resettlement colonies are what Nishant Shah has argued as the networked margins, a blending together of the edge and the margin brought about through the proliferation of mobile communication systems amongst the poor, while keeping them marginalized through social and structural conditions of oppression. The recent urban transformations that we have seen in India, which aim to create these, use technologies to create safe cities, are on the other hand reliant largely on smart technologies that are contingent upon surveillance, using GPS-enabled response vehicles, safety apps pushed to smartphones. These are conceived largely as Sarah Elwood and Agnieszka Leschinski talks with cisgendered male middle-class residents in mind, and mainly they are the main beneficiaries of these interventions. Young women in these peripheries, however, find themselves unable to benefit from these top-down technological solutions, not least because these technologies do not reach the geographic peripheries, which are characterized by fragmented infrastructures, but also because these are fundamentally constructing surveillance as a solution to violence against women and the continuous monitoring of women's bodies and spaces. And so drawing upon Gurumurthy's work, who notes that on the one hand, women's access in India to digital technology is not in itself a sign of empowerment, but on the other hand, when given the opportunity to use technology, women can articulate, particularly working class women, can articulate their struggles in a supportive and a safe space. And this experience itself can be empowering. So our project was funded, our project was called Gendering the Smart City, and it was funded under the AHRC GCRF program, and it aimed to work with a local partner NGO and a social technology partner in collaborating with these young women to curate their stories of survival and resilience using their own voices. We focused on the mobile phone as an interface between the digital public sphere and the urban public realm as a method of documenting and articulating their everyday struggles in the city and in digital space, while at the same time negotiating their own translocality between the home, the phone, and the city. We were interested not only in understanding how women use technology to navigate between the home and the city, but also how the mobile phone itself may become a tool for witnessing and documenting and curating the normalization of violence that they face across these different spaces of the city. So our work, therefore, incorporated a range of methods and outputs from which I present a feminist toolkit today. And again, this is, I don't know what's going on. It's just not moving to the next slide. Okay. So according to the American Library Association, a toolkit is a collection of authoritative and adaptable resources that enables the intended user to learn about an issue and identify approaches for addressing them. Toolkits can help translate theory into practice and typically target one issue or one audience. A feminist decolonial toolkit is a pathway for praxis that emerges from multiple ontological standpoints and is grounded in empirical realities. This toolkit is a loose collection of mechanisms, instruments, and guidelines to push back against the networks of power and authority to create new forms of decentralized, fragmented, and partial cooptations from below. The toolkit, I argue, does not aim at completion or closure. Rather, it moves beyond feminist paradigms to present a bricolage, a loose collection of practices that sit together simultaneously, but not necessarily always in complete agreement with each other, or even in agreement within itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be always coherent in its own pathway and its own process. Each pathway charted by the toolkit comes with its own disclaimers and warnings to not take it too literally. That is, each pathway has its own local context, biography, and destiny, and cannot be really taken and just applied without this understanding in any other place. So the toolkit is also embedded in local context and local politics and histories. The toolkit that I propose here today is digital, visual, oral, and participatory. It picks up on Emma Perez's idea of the decolonial imaginary as an alternative to dominant ideas of history and knowledge present in the urban and the digital realms. It also responds to what Lily Irani, Kavita Philip, and Paul Durish have called, quote, the tactics, the ways of proceeding, and need-to-know approaches to reality that expand the transdisciplinary scope of what one needs to know. The toolkit therefore presents both a praxis of technology limited by the algorithms of platforms and apps, and simultaneously a craft of everyday dwelling. And I present the feminist toolkit as a pathway to an intimate form of collaborative authoring that emerges by visually composing with and learning with and speaking back to the realities and constraints of space and technology and power. Through the toolkit, I map a pathway for those dispossessed of the public sphere of the city and the public digital realm alike to speak and see through their phone, and thus enrich urban digital space through both affective and subjective data about their own lives. So this is the toolkit that is kind of an infographic of what I plan to do, and I'm going to talk about these 4 pathways. With the curating local histories, the second toolkit is about creating safe spaces online. Third is about producing and performing spoken word, and fourth is about enriching voices with stories and enriching stories with voices. And the lighter squares are the kind of outputs that emerge from these 4 pathways, and I'll go through them one by one. So the first pathway is to curate local stories. That is considering how local archives may be nurtured from within the cracks between infrastructural assemblages, digital capacity, and local knowledge networks. And here I'm drawing upon an example that we conducted. It was a workshop, a Wikipedia editathon that was led by my colleague Padmini Ray Murray, where we conducted an editathon with these young women to write the story of their resettlement colony. This editathon was to basically make visible the presence of their lives and legitimize the presence of the resettlement colony within digital space, writing about their roots in and out of the city, the migration of slum dwellers into the city, the eviction, and finally resettlement to the peripheries. And in order to give them visibility in this Wikipedia platform, and we specifically chose Wikipedia because it's known to be more inclusive and more democratic than the usual suspects like Google, for example. Yet as soon as we started the editathon, we came across a number of roadblocks, which were to do with infrastructure, digital capacity, and of course, the question about authenticity of local knowledge. Not only was the internet difficult to access on the location that we were, it was also a drain on the limited data that the women had on their phones. On top of that, the women were unaware of the browsers because they were really constrained and confined within the closed spaces of the app. So there was a Facebook app, there's a Twitter app, there's a Google Maps app, and they were really not aware of how to navigate to the Wikipedia website and through a browser and then log in and register through there. But we got around this then at that point by conducting a post-it editathon, where these women, with the support of students from a local planning college, wrote the history of their colony, which we then translated and uploaded onto the platform. But then the moment after we uploaded it, we faced a very serious roadblock after we uploaded this page. Wikipedia marked it with a serious notice regarding its citation trail. This concerned us. Again, it's just behaving so weirdly. This notice, I don't know if you can see it online, it says that it does not cite reliable published sources. And this concerned us because if Wikipedia threatened to remove the article as non-authentic, and in the context of an editathon where most of the page was actually written based on the first-hand experiences of these young women, we could only conclude that their knowledge was, according to Wikipedia's editorial policy, deemed as legitimate knowledge. We finally got around this by using our own privileges as published authors to then put citations to our own work on slums and quarter settlements. And with insight into these academic conventions, we ensured that the page continued to exist on site. It's still there and you can log in and check it. And I think more people have added to it. Our facilitation of the authoring of this Wikipedia article can be dismissed as not truly participatory. And you can question us on whether we really achieved an improved digital capacity at all. But it can also be seen as what Vetter and Pettiway would classify as, quote, direct praxis, which can be accomplished through both assimilationist intervention and or speculative praxis. And ours was a very speculative praxis. This was a tactic that we used that enabled more privileged mediators such as us working within the existing frameworks of rules and conventions, but to tacitly subvert the site's ideological landscape by including subaltern voices and life histories. The second pathway is to create safe spaces online. And this is really where we were trying to consider how technological platforms might lay the foundations for affective spaces of support and solidarity in the networked margins. So simultaneously to the Wikipedia editathon, we set up a closed WhatsApp group that would enable real-time, free-flowing conversations between us and the women. And although we were aware of the contested nature of WhatsApp, its complicity with state surveillance, its role in the spread of misinformation, abuse, nonetheless, what we found was that the closed group that we set up provided a safe space to these women, particularly when the oppressive panoptics of family and community denied them of actual physical spaces of safety. So this online space became a space of solidarity, sharing, reflection, discussion, which was completely open and honest. And here we followed Kitchin, Sophia Malson and McArdle's work, where they talk about platforms and suggest that we create more contextual and relational grids of knowledge, quoting them to openly recognize their contested and negotiated politics and practice. The WhatsApp diaries therefore created a genre of authorship amongst the women that has a wide appeal in the current digital age, using things like selfies, free verse, shorthand text, emojis. And in this space, women used both parody and dark humor to transform shame, humiliation, and fear into reflection, refusal, and resistance. And I can't talk about all the material that came out into the WhatsApp diary, but one of the examples I want to pick up is the space of solidarity, the creation of spaces of solidarity through the production of selfies. And we were always inundated in the WhatsApp group with selfies, particularly when the women went out into the city. Selfies here were significant in a context where networked violence was the pervasive experience and vulnerability of coming to the city, but also of returning home. Because if you violate the curfew at home, then again, there is a danger of violence at home. So selfies marked their freedoms as snapshot moments during the continuous anticipation of violence between the home, the phone, and the city. They also enabled witnessing of potential danger, of intense vulnerabilities and fear of violence. And in this context, safety was not seen through the geolocational capacities of Google or the safety apps that are continuously pushed to the smartphones. Rather, safety was seen through the mobile phone by writing texts on violence and confinement experienced in this gendered city, by putting up images of their own documentation and evidence of their own presence and visibility in the city. And here I draw upon Nunes's work, where she also talks about the question of selfie, that the selfies are self-witnessing. And she says this act of self-witnessing serves as a form of parasocial civic engagement that attempts to communicate one's own place within interpenetrating social spaces, no matter how gawking or disengaged they may appear at first analysis. Selfies, therefore, were an analog format of geotagging their locations in the city. The selfies represented their datafied bodies, such as leaving home, coming of age in the city, framing friendships, networks, solidarities, expressing affection for each other, etc. And they represented a framing of the gendered self as well-groomed, smart, well-located, young urban women. And so they tagged the city literally at arm's length, and obviously selfies were restrained by the front-facing camera, but that stage, the city has a backdrop with the women at the foreground, tagging and witnessing their presence and visibility across the city. The third platform is the production and performance of the spoken word. And part of our collaboration, of course, included, apart from the WhatsApp diaries, it included regular face-to-face workshops, whether this was in physical spaces, but also more recently, as I'll talk about this later, in online Zoom meetings since the pandemic struck. And in these face-to-face workshops, we directed our reflections and in-depth discussions towards the production of spoken word. That is the prose that simulated a series of tongue-in-cheek verses by the women as a collective exercise which sought to document the sexual harassment that they faced in the streets, in the neighborhood, even at home. Participants quickly began to turn their abuses on their head by appropriating offensive phrases within a wordplay of free-flowing verses. And from these emerged a rap song that became a bit wider than just the sexual harassment, that charted, again, their stories and their experiences through the city. And here we aimed for an audience that was wide and much diverse than just us as researchers and their own community in the resettlement colony, because we understood that the rap song could be picked up by people generally interested in these kinds of things, but also it was later picked up by several media houses nationally and internationally. It was played in innumerable third sector forums and meetings with the local state, as well as in global meetings organized by the UN and development organizations. And most significantly, the young women then were invited to join ongoing consultations organized by feminist NGOs towards a new gender-sensitive master plan for Delhi. At this point, I just wanted to show, maybe I won't play the whole video. You can always go on YouTube and find it, but I will play probably some part of the video so you understand what whoa. I don't know what's happening. Why does this not become full size?
क्या गलती है मेरी, रोज छेड़छाड़ केस होते हैं। क्या गलती है मेरी, दिल्ली में रोज 6 से ज्यादा रेप होते हैं।
क्यों समाज ने मुझको दबाया है, बिना खुद को सुधारे मुझे घर में बिठाया है।
निर्भया फूलन देवी बिल्किस या वो नन्ही सी लड़की, याद रहेगी उन्हें सबकी कहानी।
नए दिन हो गए हैं, आसमां में तारीख हो गए हैं। तारीख पे तारीख, इंसाफ की ड्यूटी से पुलिस भी है फारिग। मैं पंख फैलाना चाहती हूँ जिंदा दिल और बेखौफ, मैं खुलकर जीना चाहती हूँ, मैं खुलकर जीना चाहती हूँ। ओ दिल्ली जरा अपना दिल तो खोल, ओ दिल्ली जरा अपना दिल तो खोल। नारी शक्ति है अनमोल अनमोल, मन की बातें बहना तू भी बोल, तू भी बोल।
More power to you, sister. More power to you. More power to you, sister. More power to you. More power to you, sister. More power to you. More power to you, sister. More power to you.
So sorry about all the technical glitches, but I hope you made out as much of it as you could. And sorry if some of you have already heard this before, because it's been played quite a lot. But you can also go on YouTube and see the video again if you want to. So moving on from there, the final pathway that I want to talk about is our stories, our voices, giving voices to stories and giving stories to voices. And this shaped particularly post-pandemic, when the pandemic had struck, and this led to a series of community podcasts. What happened at that time is that after the pandemic had struck and women got confined in the home, it highlighted to us even more significantly that the final aspect of our toolkit has to be to facilitate the production of voices that could speak to some of these deathly silences of being locked into impossible conditions of work and study from home. And the first collateral of the pandemic that we found out through our WhatsApp messaging was that the women actually held off recharging their phones, or they actually lost access to the phone because they were sitting at home and arguably didn't need the phone as such. The second collateral that happened is that the women found it much harder to access public toilets or public transport. And the phone, when available, actually remained an important tool to stay connected with friends and relatives far away. Without the phone, mental health became a serious issue. In this context, we went back to the resettlement colony online, virtually, and recruited another set of young women, some of them the original group, but some new women, to join a series of 8 podcast training workshops over Zoom. And through the help of, and this happened throughout last year, through the help of a community artist and a sound artist, we trained the women to record and edit their own voice and of others using their mobile phones. And it led to a production of 4 community podcasts titled Our Stories, Our Voices. And it's a channel on SoundCloud, where every couple of weeks we were uploading these each podcast each week. And each of these podcasts actually were on a theme that the women identified was important in the context of COVID, that the themes that they were significant during the lockdown. And here you see a word cloud of all the conversations we had. And one of the key things that began to rise very seriously was the issue of time. Not just time as in don't have time, but also wasted time, to sit around passing time, and time becoming actually a difficulty and a sense of dispossession and marginalization. So, unsurprisingly, our first COVID podcast was on time. And then there were a series of 3 other podcasts. The second was on education. And that was a very, very important aspect of their lives as well, because as soon as they were locked inside their home, education and attending classes became a serious issue of negotiation within the family, when there's only one mobile from which, maybe 2 or 3 siblings have to access their education. The third was on clothes. And again, this became a really serious issue about, how do we dress up when we're sitting at home, and, what happens and how people see us when we go outside and inside. And the fourth theme was on marriage. And this was not necessarily just about COVID, but it was generally about marriage. What happens when, you're sitting at home, you're, a young woman, and the family thinks about yourself as of marriageable age. And yet, you can't say that I'm going to work and I'm going to do further education, because here you are sitting at home, locked in under COVID. So I don't have the time today to delve into the whole process of the podcast, community podcast, but I will say that the podcast actually reappropriated some of the tools that are offered by existing digital platforms to present a low-tech vernacular of speaking. And that's the other reason I don't play it today, because it's in Hindi. But this vernacular was also not just speaking, but also of listening, of storytelling and listening to each other. These women were going out into their neighborhoods and interviewing other women to ask them about time, to ask them about clothes and marriage and education. And some of this filtered into the podcast as well. So it worked well with the unstructured nature of the workshop discussions, reflecting the fluidity across digital analog platforms, and more importantly, the technology for listening to and distributing these podcasts. Because these were relatively simple, we assumed that these will not only be listened to by a diversity of audience, but also shared as well. So I want to just conclude by saying that the enduring significance of a feminist toolkit for decolonization lies in its potential to push back against the power dynamics vested in this datafication of the gendered city that's very apparent right now through the use of smart technologies for surveillance. I argue that the toolkit presents 4 pathways that offer what Walter Mignolo calls an epistemic disobedience in refusing to be confined by the terms and conditions of technology from above, because it captures the politics of a decolonizing encounter at the margins of a digital urban age. As Mignolo notes, this means, quote, the unveiling of epistemic silences of Western epistemology and affirming the epistemic rights of those in the networked margins. This means that poor women are no longer completely bound by the limits of digital capacity as subjects of state patronage, which constructs the significance of digital space for these women only as the ability to access welfare and the different programs of the state. Rather, I argue that the toolkit uses indigenous forms of expression and knowledge, not only by presenting new possibilities of translation in the digital analog margins, but also underlining the affective and resistant potential of data through markers such as anger, joy, freedom, despair, that emerges from these reflections. I will also say that this feminist toolkit has many limits. It isn't complete or has achieved any sense of closure or perfection, because it is always bound by the dynamics and constraints of infrastructures, gender power, and structural disadvantages. However, as the toolkit enables those in the digital margins to reconstruct affective data as non-foundational, it is also therefore open to diverse knowledge systems and approaches. And this has important consequences for us on the ways that we think about decolonization, or we might approach the praxis of decolonization through affective data, through translation, through the languages and idioms of cultural exchange between the digital, the urban, and the intimate. And the toolkit's decolonizing potential, and I say with seriousness about the word potential, it's not achieved its perfection, and will never do. But the potential of it lies only in exposing the structural and symbolic legacies of power through the various failures and slippages that I have talked about today, but also in foregrounding a very polycentric way of thinking, rethinking the contours of colonization and decolonization of affective data across digital analog spaces. Thank you.
Ayona, for this incredibly inspiring talk, a wonderful account on how to create engagement, empowerment, and emancipatory actions through research and data. And I would ask the audience now if there is any compelling question specific to the talk. Otherwise, you can keep it in mind anyway and reserve it for the question and answer session. Perfect. Okay, we can move on, and it is again now a huge pleasure to introduce you. Now you see him, to introduce you the next keynote speaker, Rob Kitchin, who is a professor in Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute and the Department of Geography. His research work has spanned a number of interrelated domains, including software, big data, smart cities, cartographic theory, mapping and dashboard, data infrastructures and practices, and so on. Professor Kitchin has been principal investigator of several large research projects funded by various Irish, British, European, and international agencies. Among the most recent, he was a European Research Council advanced investigator on the Programmable City project and a principal investigator on the Building City Dashboard project funded by Science Foundation Ireland. He was the 2013 recipient of the Royal Irish Academy's Gold Medal for the Social Sciences. And Professor Kitchin is the author of and co-author of several academic books, articles, and book chapters, including Code Space with Martin Dodge and The Data Revolution, and the recently published Data Lives. And he has been editor of various scientific journals, such as Dialogues in Human Geography, Progress in Human Geography, and was the co-editor-in-chief of the International Encyclopedia of Human Geography. Rob Kitchin is a fiction writer himself, having published novels and short stories across the genres of crime fiction and black comedy, I would say. You can enjoy his writing in his website, and especially in his blog called The View from the Blue House, where he writes book reviews and challenges himself with I Learned Troubles, which are stories of exactly 100 words. Professor Kitchin's today's keynote is entitled the right to the smart city. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Claudia, for the invitation to and to the conference organised for the invitation to speak. So yeah, I'm going to do a kind of a synoptic overview. So whereas Ayona's talk was quite detailed around a particular project and drew out themes from that, I'm just really going to maybe give more of a kind of a high level, drawing out various kinds of themes around this notion of the right to the smart city and various kinds of issues and problematics relating to the smart city. So yeah, let's move on. So I think most people will be familiar with the idea of the smart city. I mean, for me, it's really trying to manage and govern the city through a whole series of network digital technologies that kind of spread across a series of different domains, whether that's government and city operating systems, urban dashboards, and so on, or whether it's security and emergency services and kind of predictive policing, coordinated emergency response, centralized control rooms, into transport with things like intelligent transport systems, bike share, real-time passenger information, logistics management, and so on, through into energy, into waste, into environments, all kinds of sensor networks, into building management systems, into our homes, and into the civic domain and various kinds of civic media, and so on. So this is a kind of a city. So to go to the theme of kind of a sense in the city, this is generating most often real-time data and using that data to run the city in some fashion. Now, again, as you'll be aware, there's been a lot of hype around this notion of the smart city and the kind of the promise that it will deliver. Often captured in these kind of six themes. So there's a notion which will create a smart economy, fostering entrepreneurship, innovation, productivity, competitiveness. It will create a smart environment through fostering green energy, creating sustainability, generating resilience, and so on. Into notions of smart mobility, intelligent transport systems, interoperable systems, creating efficiency, into creating more efficient, effective cost reduction, notions of smart government, so fostering transparency, accountability, participation, evidence-informed decision-making, better service delivery, smart living, quality of life, safety, security, managing risk, and aiding people, creating smart people, more informed, fostering creativity, inclusiveness, empowerment, and so on. And to a large degree, most people would kind of think that those kinds of things are relatively positive, and why would you be against the smart city? But of course, there's been quite a lot of pushback against this notion of the smart city as something that's overly technocratic, as being kind of technologically solutionist, and so on. So these are kind of some of the main kind of critiques that come out in the literature and within policy debates. So the way in which it frames the city itself as a sort of kind of system of systems, as something that's knowable, rational, and steerable, as opposed to something that's very kind of complex, full of wicked problems, full of contestation, and so on. In its kind of claims towards being objective, neutral, and non-ideological, through its underpinning of a kind of or its expression of a neoliberal political economy, and the way in which a lot of this technology is being delivered by companies, and therefore leads to a kind of a corporatization of governance, as ways of managing the city get outsourced to companies. The way in which the city is cast as an accumulation strategy. So this is kind of tech-led entrepreneurial urbanism, a kind of a third wave, if you like, of entrepreneurial urbanism after the kind of planning creative cities into smart cities. The kinds of governance that it seeks to enact, which is very technocratic, delivered through algorithms and automated processes, and a kind of solutionism that technology is a way of solving all city problems rather than kind of policy or community development or various kinds of politics and so on. That it changes the nature of citizenship, so kind of a neoliberal forms of citizenship, which I'll come back to, and shifts the notion of governmentality from discipline towards control. That it has a very kind of ahistorical, aspatial notion of the city, so it kind of ignores kind of culture, history, politics, and so on, and is kind of very much in the here and the now kind of view. That it creates buggy, brittle, hackable systems. So you stick anything on a network and it can be hacked. And there's a whole series of examples now of cities being held by ransomware attacks and by attacks on infrastructure where the infrastructure falls over and doesn't function. That it reinforces power relations and inequalities in the city because it's designed to serve certain populations over other populations, and that there are kind of profound social, political, and ethical effects. So those kind of critiques have led into this notion of, well, can we recast the smart city? Can we reimagine it? Can we rethink it? And so on. And it raises a whole series of questions. So, what are the ethical implications of smart city approaches? How are citizens expected to act and participate in the smart city? How is the public space and urban commons framed and regulated? What sorts of publics can be formed? What kinds of actions can they take? To what extent are injustices embedded in city systems, infrastructures, and services? What are their calculated practices? What systems and structures of inequality are reproduced? What models of citizenship are enacted? What forms of social justice operate, and what are their effects? And ultimately, it comes down to what kind of smart city do we want to create and live in? And there's a whole bunch of kind of critical scholars have been starting to work through these kinds of questions, as have NGOs and citizen groups and so on. So to move towards kind of where that leaves us in terms of recasting the smart city, I'm going to kind of run through some of these and think through some of these kinds of issues. So I guess there are kind of three main kind of approaches onto this. The first is a kind of a procedural regulatory interventions. So this is kind of interventions that are rooted around things like ethics, law, but also technical solutions. So this is basically, how do we create a better smart city? How do we kind of regulate those technologies so that they don't discriminate against people and they serve whole populations and so on? So things like privacy, data protection, data governance, data security, trying to re-envisage and orientate the smart city so it's fair and proportionate. Of course, the critique of this is that it reifies existing structural relations rather than challenging and transforming them. It's about tweaking what's already there rather than fundamentally rethinking them or remaking them. The second has really been around this notion of inverting the ethos and use of smart city technologies. So this is the notion around kind of citizen-centric smart cities or just smart cities. So it draws more on kind of moral philosophy, so ideas of citizenship, social justice, ethics and care, the right to the city, and a notion of which we kind of create a genuinely humanizing smart urbanism, to echo David Harvey's phrase. So again, this is not about getting rid of smart cities. This is about how we recast them in a different way. And then the third is to effectively be against smart cities and to try and discontinue or block their deployment, or try to orient the city around other kinds of matters. And then the last kind of thing I'm going to briefly talk about this at the end of the talk is around the notion of decentering the smart city. So as Ayona was talking about decolonizing the smart city, I'm going to talk about decentering, which comes from the same kind of theoretical space, I guess. And so there are questions here, between that kind of first and second question here is a kind of a normative about what should be and what has to be, and a kind of a difference, a kind of contrast between principles, values, and ethos, which is around vision, around meeting obligations, which is about compliance. So the first one is really often around compliance. Second one is more around ethos and principles. And I think this is nicely summed up in some of the work that Catherine D'Agio and Laurent Klein has done, where they're contrasting this kind of technical procedural approaches onto technology versus kind of normative ideological kinds of approaches. So their work is around data feminism, and they kind of argue that the way in which governments are typically approaching the kind of some of the problems around the way that technical systems are working and reproduce various inequalities and so on, is by this kind of regulatory procedural kind of view. And it's using a lens of kind of ethics, bias, consumer rights, fairness, regulation, accountability, transparency, and so on. But it locates the source of the problem in individuals and technical systems. Whereas their right-hand side of their table is kind of a more recognizing that the structural power, and recognizing that actually needs to be changes within society as opposed to how individuals or technical systems work. And so they make the argument that really we need to be thinking around justice and oppression, citizenship, equity, commons and the public good, co-liberation, reflexivity, and so on. So this is not about tinkering with algorithms. This is about understanding history, culture, and context, and the way in which as a society we orientate on and use these technologies and so on. So this is not necessarily about ethical procedures or tinkering with law. This is about a kind of a normative view on society and how we as a collective kind of think about and act in relation to these technologies. So to take this kind of, and of course one doesn't replace the other, like everything on the left-hand side of that column are all things that we should be looking to achieve, but they need to be complemented and extended by the things on the right-hand side of the column. So the kind of technical kinds of procedural kinds of concerns that are typically trying to be dealt with by things like standards groups and ethics committees and advisory boards and so on, are these kinds of things around surveillance and privacy, the ownership and control of data, the ways in which those data are used for social sourcing and for redlining, the way they're used in predictive profiling and anticipatory governance, such as predictive policing, the way in which algorithmic systems try to nudge people and enact behavioral change, the way in which they can feed into dynamic pricing, issues around data security, and issues around control creep. So systems designed for one purpose starting to be used for another purpose, often in relation to designed to deal with one thing in the city, but often end up being used in policing or security, for example. And the kind of technical solutions, procedural solutions and tactics that are then enacted to deal with that are things like, can come in different ways, but they're often through the market, through technology, through regulation, and through governance. So if we were to think around kind of data privacy security issues in relation to the smart city, then these are the kinds of ways in which that's dealt with. So the market has a response around industry standards and self-regulation, about trying to create ethics as a competitive advantage. There'll be a whole series of work around technological solutions, so end-to-end strong encryption, access controls, security controls, audit trails, and so on. Adoption of privacy enhancement tools. The policy and regulation front is around kind of fair information practice principles, privacy by design, security by design, education and training. And governance is around kind of vision and strategy, oversight and delivery and compliance, and around day-to-day delivery by privacy teams and smart city teams and so on. But this is all a very kind of technical, procedural way of trying to ensure compliance around certain expectations around how these technologies will work. They're not about fundamentally rethinking kind of social spatial relations and kind of society's kind of normative kind of view around what and who the smart city should be for. The kind of normative ideological framework strategy, the kind of the right-hand kind of column of Catherine Lauren's table, is more around a kind of a moral philosophy around the smart city and how we might want to rethink the smart city in a different kind of way, to reimagine it, remake it in a different way around these kind of ideas that are right to the smart city, or issues around citizenship, social justice, ethics of care, and so on. I'm just going to run through these. So obviously the right to the smart city work is kind of rooted in kind of Henry Lefebvre's work on the right to the city, and it kind of says, well, we need to take these kind of technical procedural issues seriously, but we need to frame them within a more normative ideological approach. So the right to the city has a whole series of rights and entitlements built into the notion. So, the fundamentally it's about, well, space should be shaped according to its inhabitants' needs and not predominantly determined by a political and economic elite. So includes things like right to habitation. So all citizens receive a material living wage, shelter, recognition, respect, dignity, and so on. A right to participation and self-determination, and a whole series of related rights around the right to information, free expression, culture, difference, equality, self-management, public and non-public services, free movement to occupy public space, to protect the private commons, protect the commons from from being privatized, the right to meet and gather, and to political representation and to vote, and so on. And you could argue that the kind of corporate state version of the smart city erodes a lot of these kinds of rights through its kind of neoliberal citizenship and its kind of privatization and marketization of public services and so on. Again, people are kind of focused on this notion of citizenship, and so there's been calls for a kind of citizen-centric smart cities, but then there's a question as to what does that really mean and what kind of notion of citizenship is involved in that, because it's quite clear from those in certainly in the corporate sector, but often in the state sector as well, that the notion of citizenship being operated is really a kind of a neoliberal version of citizenship. So a citizen-centric smart city is rooted in neoliberal citizenship around the idea of kind of individual autonomy and freedom of choice, but within a set of constraints. So people really get to navigate, negotiate the provision of services and the kind of levels of access, but it's based on capital and their ability to be able to afford those services rather than rights and entitlements. So it's a particular form of citizenship. And what's really happened is when cities were kind of recast as citizen-centric or citizen-focused, they were really empty signifiers, and it was a rebranding exercise to try and make the smart city more palatable, without actually fundamentally changing or shifting what was meant by citizen-centric. So citizens were kind of really general or absent in the work of Taylor Shelton and Thomas Lodado's work on Atlanta, or is a very narrow group of active citizens who tended to be kind of technologically orientated, white male, middle class kinds of citizens. Those kinds of people, or young men, the kinds of people who can take part in hackathons and so on, and were largely unrepresentative of the wider population. And generally citizens were kind of casted, were kind of, recipients of stewardship, so the state acting for citizens, or civic paternalism, where the state is deciding and companies are deciding what is best for citizens. So it's very kind of tokenistic. And in our work with Paolo Cordello on Dublin, we kind of try to map out. So sorry, this table's quite busy, but it's basically taking Einstein's ladder of participation and mapping it onto the smart city. So we kind of have forms and levels of participation up on the left hand side, and then we're going to have the roles that citizens are expected to play. So down at the bottom, you're really a data point. You're the next level up on you're the product, or you're the consumer, or you're the resident, or you're a recipient. You might be a participant or a tester or a proposer, but it's only at the very top layer, this kind of shaded green, where citizens are involved in any kind of meaningful way in the way in which smart city technology has been developed. And on the right-hand side, we can kind of see some of the Dublin examples of different smart city initiatives and technologies. And so citizen involvement here is really, down here, you're steered, nudge, controlled. Here you're kind of browse, consumed, act, then your feedback, suggest, negotiate, produce, and then it's only really at the top level where you have leadership, vision, ownership, and so on. And very few of the initiatives in Dublin have any meaningful citizen involvement in the projects. And here we've got, the examples I've got at the top here are things like Code for Ireland and Togue, which is a kind of hacker space, civic hackathons, living labs, and so on. And in a city of 1.3 million people, we're probably talking about 200 to 300 active people, and they're from a particular class and from particular groups, and they're really not representative of most of the people who live in the city. And so there's very clear questions around this notion of what is a citizen-centric smart city, and who is it really trying to serve. A third way in which we can kind of come onto this kind of normative thinking around the smart city is through the lens of social justice. So social justice concerns the expected, acceptable ways in which people are treated and the conditions in which they live. Typically, theories of social justice fall into four broad types: distributional, procedural, retributive, and restorative. So this is fair share, fair treatment, fair punishment for wrongs, and righting of wrongs. And I often hear people say, we should have a just smart city. We should have a smart city that recognizes justice. And my response to that is always, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what version of social justice are you hoping will be enacted? Because there are different theories of social justice, and which version is adopted will make a fundamental difference to the principles and the ethos underpinning smart urbanism. And again, apologies, this table is very busy. You can get the slides. So, I'm sure the conference organizers will let you get the slides. But this is basically to illustrate that. So if you're an egalitarian, which is basically everybody has equality regardless of ability and inheritance. That's different to if you're a utilitarian, where you believe in the greatest good for the greatest number. Or if you're a libertarian and you believe in individual autonomy over the state and the free market is inherently just. Or if you're a contractarianism and you want to find a distribution of resources that all involved considers to be just, not to be equal. So if you're a libertarian, your notion of social justice is basically that the free market is inherently just, and so a kind of a smart city that reproduces inequalities and inequities and is spatially uneven and so on is an inherently just arrangement. We could argue that as a city that has smart justice, has social justice, if that's your theory of social justice. So there are real questions when people say they want a just smart city. What is it that they actually really want? What kind of set of social relations and kind of ethos and principles are they expecting to be enacted in creating that smart city. And I don't think we really have that debate, and I certainly don't hear it at industry events or even at kind of state-held events, that kind of normative kind of argument. The kind of arguments around citizenship and justice are mostly at this kind of commonsensical post-politics kind of level, which is really really a kind of a neoliberal form of understanding of those of what that means, of what a citizen-centric or a just smart city actually means. Another way of thinking around this is the notion of an ethics of care. So some of the work that I've been doing on this notion of slow computing is rooted in this kind of notion, this kind of feminist ethics of care, which is it's kind of moral action at the personal collective level to aid others. So this is about kind of reciprocal and non-reciprocal arrangements in relation to that. So it's kind of how best to respond rather than what is just. So this is around responsibilities, obligations, duties, not necessarily principles, rights, and entitlements. And in municipalities, in local government, it's usually reflected in the notion of stewardship and civic paternalism. But it's also quite clear that there's a highly differentiated notion of an ethics of care across populations and different social groups within society. Now, I've not much more to say about that, in the sense that there's not been that much work kind of explicating this kind of notion in relation to the smart city, and there needs to be a bit kind of done in relation to that. And so this kind of brings us on to this kind of notion of a genuinely humanizing smart urbanism. For me, all of those kind of debates kind of highlight that we kind of need to move beyond a kind of commonsensical, taken for granted, pragmatic, practical, technical, post-political notions of the smart city, and we need to avoid kind of citizenship washing or ethics washing, which is clearly going on in relation to how companies, and in some cases states, are trying to use their kind of technical procedural regulatory approaches as a way of trying to highlight that they're doing something without actually doing anything meaningful. A lot of the advisory boards often have little meaningful input into what's going on, and they're an exercise in trying to give the impression that something is happening when it really isn't happening, and things are just proceeding as normal. I think the kind of discussion highlights the need to reframe, reimagine, and remake the smart city within an emancipatory and empowering framework. And the right to the city seems a framework through which to kind of proceed in relation to doing that, and to draw on kind of notions of citizenship, social justice, equity, democracy, fairness, and so on in relation to doing that. Now, advancing that kind of argument and advancing a kind of normative view of this is not straightforward. It's not very easy, given the interests and states of corporations and the kind of embedded trajectory of capitalism and neoliberalism. But it's definitely needed, in my view, if we're going to produce the kinds of smart cities that that will be more kind of emancipatory and empowering in their conception. Because a further step is to actually decenter the smart cities. This is some of the stuff I just started to think about more recently about kind of moving beyond the smart city, I guess, is one way of thinking of it. So the decentering is kind of seeing through a technology and its position in relation to systems of oppression. So this is trying to move away from the reification of technologies and recognize them as agents of wider structural forces. So it's a focus on the future city in a more holistic sense, rather than focusing on the smart city. It's a focus on the city and how smartness might or might not be a means of realizing a fairer, more open, tolerant city. So this is not about inserting equality and justice into smartness, but about how smartness might create equality and justice in conjunction with other kinds of interventions. So this is not about a kind of technical solutionist. This is about linking up things across kind of policy, collaborative planning, community development, investing packages, multi-stakeholder engagement, and so on. So this is often smart cities starts from the position of technology, and this is doing the opposite of that. So it's not starting with tech and then looking for the problem that tech might solve, but turning first to tech for a solution. It's about starting with what the problem is and recognizing that a lot of the issues the city faces are not going to be fixed through technological solutionism. Homelessness is not going to be fixed with an app. It's a problem of deep structural inequality, domestic violence, mental health services, all kinds of stuff. Congestion is not going to be fixed with intelligent transport system. It's going to be fixed by people moving onto public transit and walking and cycling and so on. Institutionalized racism in predictive policing won't be fixed by tinkering with the data and the algorithms. It will be fixed by structural change inside how policing works. So platform and surveillance capitalism are not separate or distinct forms of capitalism. Racism expressed through smart urbanism is not cut adrift from the structural logics and operations of institutionalized racism. Instead, smart city technologies and our operations need to be framed in relation to capitalism and racism per se. The solutions are anti-capitalism alternatives and anti-racism in which smart cities might or they might not play some part. But we don't start from the position of they're definitely the solution and technology will fix this. So in a way, I'm kind of arguing to move from smart urbanism to focusing on urbanism, to kind of move beyond smart cities, to not lose focus of the kind of the technologies and so on, but to kind of decenter them and think them in a slightly different way. And I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob, for this great and very inspiring talk. Offered like an analytical repertoire to make sense of smart urbanist processes. And you gave us a sort of vaccine toward the many ways this concept is disguised and made as a commonplace, I think. Well, I would say, like before, if there is any question specific and compelling for the keynote that we just listened by Professor Kitchin. Otherwise, I will just go on with the question and answer sessions, and I invite the audience of, I see that there are appearing comments in the chat already, and I invite the audience to jump in and to raise the hand. I will make them able to have the floor and ask the question directly, or I could read them in the chat. I can have some reading now. Thomas is writing, thanks for this interesting lecture. In the overview of theories and principles of justice, epistemic justice was not mentioned. Probably is for you, Rob. Together with the right to science, it seems an obvious candidate to be a building block for humanizing smart urbanism.
Yeah, yes is the answer. I mean, yeah, absolutely, of course. I was kind of framing off justice, but we can, you can add as many different forms of justice to this as you like. But yeah, clearly, the kind of stuff around epistemic and epistemology and so on, so would be part of that. Yeah.
Okay, and I see another question or comment by Corentin. In my view, corporations and states push for smart cities in order to achieve growth. Do you agree? Well, and if so, do you think we should criticize the race for growth or the smart path to achieve it?
Yeah, it is partly about growth. It is about economic development, and it is about managing. Well, it also is about managing services and so on. So, I mean, you will find it in shrinking cities as well, and maybe as a way to try and halt some of the decline and maybe to reverse fortunes. But you would probably find if you were to talk to people who are involved in smart cities, they would say that's just one element of a whole part of, you know, like the smart city technologies are serving a whole series of you know, the discursive landscape kind of justifying them, you know, so it's about safety, security, effectiveness, efficiency, competitive advantage, economic development, you know, all that kind of promises and perils at the beginning. You know, it's about participation, it's about transparency, it's about accountability, it's about, there are lots of discursive drivers on why smart cities are being developed and promoted. But yeah, definitely growth is part of that, or to try and slow down or halt decline.
Yeah, and, I don't see raised hand. I will try to. I see that there are other keynote, but well, if I may, if I don't see any other question, I have some question also for Professor Datta, Ayona's talk, if I may. Otherwise, yeah. And I will give you, the audience, the time to step up. I will invite you to step up with the audio and video, by the way, in any case. And well, it was a great, I was thinking, Rob also connected the centering and decolonized aspect. And I think this is a very interesting and common aspects of your talk. I think the focus on the ground. Rob said from smart urbanism to urbanism, the move. And in your talk, Ayona, you insisted a lot on the formation of local knowledge that seemed to me is not given, is to be formed through this mechanism of generation. And I was really excited that you used a tool of popular cultures in order to let's say enact and develop this creativeness of the citizen. And I would like to ask you about this, if you can comment a little bit on the role of popular culture in cities and local knowledge.
Thanks, Claudia. That's a really interesting but also very loaded question. Popular culture is everywhere. I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, what we were trying to do is write on that popular culture, particularly, you know, on the one hand, you have the whole digital revolution in India, and it's no longer that women, like particularly young men and women, are far away from technology. They all have mobile phones. If not a smartphone, they'll have an Android smartphone. They don't necessarily have Apple. But at the same time, I think what's left out or what we don't really know about is how they actually use this mobile phone. And some of our discussions in the WhatsApp diaries, but also in face-to-face workshops, was the mobile phone is actually a space of leisure, and that is used to go on YouTube, watch Bollywood music, watch cooking recipes. And people said during COVID, particularly, they learned a lot of cooking online. So it's not so different in a way from maybe middle-class youth, just that the structural disadvantages are very different. So popular culture completely is a very important role in the way that technology shapes young women's and men's lives in these resettlement colonies or lower-income colonies. But we also wanted to make that not just a space of leisure, or not just a space where we sit and analyze what it is, but also turn that into something that could speak back. And so when we were thinking about the rap song, we hadn't actually thought that it would be a rap song per se. We just thought, well, you know, you guys are so good at singing, because they love to sing every time we got together. You guys are so good at writing poetry. They would just take little words and turn it into poetry. I said, what if we turn this into a song? And initially, the idea was that it would be something similar to a Bollywood song. And it was just us that then sort of said, well, why don't we try something different? Why don't we try rap song? And it was fascinating because even though they are so into YouTube, even though they're so into popular culture, they hadn't actually explored the rap kind of genre, but then they took to it. And I feel it's popular culture is not just in bringing these women and getting them motivated and getting them to do these kind of really interesting things that they talked about later, but also in using popular culture as a tool of decolonization, as a tool to speak back and make others listen. The reason that people listened to this rap song, why it circulated so much, it was picked up by National Geographic, so it kind of went international, was because of the genre in which the language, the idiom through which the message was translated. So I think it was very, very important, of course, that we picked up these popular culture stuff. And then finally, recently, the community podcasts, again, it was easily shareable, easily possible to listen to. It didn't take too much data to listen to podcasts as well, whereas with videos, it takes a lot of data. And that was something that women were cutting down on. And then the last thing I want to say is at the end of the project, when we went back and did a debriefing with the women, and they said, this is a project that was the most fun. And they said, you made gender fun because they have loads of NGOs in these places. They come, they do gender training workshops. They tell them what to do. They tell them how they're marginalized. They tell them how to cope. They give them information, access to knowledge, tell them about the laws that will give them their rights. But they said, you made gender fun, and it was about ourselves. We could tell our stories in our voices, and that's the title of the talk today as well, that they could tell their story, that it wasn't someone telling them what gender is. It wasn't someone telling them how to get their rights through legal access, etc. It was very different. And in that sense, it was also a place of leisure for them. So they were doing all of this stuff, not feeling that they were made to work hard by another NGO, another outside actor, but they were doing it because they were enjoying it. It was also their space of leisure.
Yeah, and that's a great way to engage, and also to be a little bit subversive using this kind of means. And as you said, refocusing the perspective, regendering in your terms the perspective, and was a great a method to imitate, I guess. I see that there are a few questions here after we spoke. Can I invite Jusmet to pose the question directly, or Mateus, if they like? No, I don't hear any. Don't be shy, I mean. Okay, I'm going to read them, but I just want to make sure that you are able to ask the rising hand, I guess you. Okay. This is, excuse me?
I don't think, I think when you join the room, you say whether you just want to listen or whether you're going to use your microphone or not. So if they might not actually be able to turn the microphone on.
No, because we are, yeah.
Okay, hi.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepared to come live. So anyway, but I'm working on an Indian smart city, and I was working specifically on segregation in that smart city in Rajasthan, in India. And I was just wondering, how does segregation stall, alter, affect, or change this whole project of the smart city, the making of a city which is not smart, a smart city? So that was my question for Professor Rao.
And I think could be to both of
I'd say more for both of us, and Ayona probably has much better knowledge set than me to be able to answer this question in the context. Yeah, I mean, you might find that the stakeholders within a smart city will say that these technologies and approaches are about trying to break down segregation and about trying to enable participation and so on. But a critique, of course, is that they often deepen and widen social and spatial divisions in the way that they work in terms of who they're designed to serve and who they exclude. So the ways in which forms of anticipatory governance and predictive policing end up targeting particular locations, the ways in which dynamic pricing differentially affects some places, the way in which redlining works, so predictive profiling that ends up limiting people's kind of rental and mortgage choices and ability to be able to live in particular parts of the city, and so on. So while the rhetoric is often around trying to address some of these things, the reality is the way that technologies work. So there's a lot of very good work around this, around kind of Virginia Eubank's book around automating inequality, or some of the work that Ruha Benjamin's done around kind of racial inequalities and technologies and so on. A lot of the kind of the ways in which kind of prejudice and discrimination work are embedded into the algorithms. They're certainly embedded within stuff like predictive policing, where it's quite clear that predictive policing is often racial profiling. I don't know if Ayona, you'd want to talk particularly to kind of the kind of segregation in the Indian context, particularly in relation to, I guess, the community of women you're talking about, who are obviously quite segregated group.
Yeah, I think how much to say, where to stop, really. I think just very briefly, the Indian smart cities are a very different ballgame from the kind of the other models of smart cities. They are very specific projects that are targeted at specific areas in the city. So obviously, they're not really looking to remove segregation in any way. They're trying to just kind of do interventions in specific parts. There are some pan-city projects, but they are not necessarily, again, towards social inclusion as such. You might have an e-bus system or a smart sewage system, which are pan-city. But the specific smart city projects, initiatives, they might be about constructing a smart road. They might be about constructing, a smart riverfront. So they don't necessarily claim to be removing segregation in any way or form. At least that's my understanding of looking through quite a few of them. But often they do target spaces that, which have potential for value creation. So if there's a riverfront with, a quarter settlement there, that land could be easily captured to create a different kind of gentrified project there. So it's so varied across different cities. I'm not sure which city you are particularly looking at, but I'd agree with Rob. The situation is so complex, and if the claim is not to remove segregation, I'm not sure that I would say that it's successful or a failure. You need to look at what the parameters are.
Yeah, I mean, I think your work on like Dollara, it's kind of it's about dispossessing. It's about dispossessing land and gaining land, and your case study on Shimla. It's about displacing kind of a migrant working class community off a piece of land to claim it as a smart city. So in some cases, it's actually actively disenfranchising communities in terms of who the land is then appropriated for in terms of developing the new smart city. I suspect if we were to look at cities in the West, it often gets linked into gentrification. Mm-hmm. So where you have smart districts and living labs and so on, they end up becoming gentrifying parts of the city and displace that. Now there are some cities who would claim that they have policies designed to try and limit that. So Medellin in Colombia, their innovation district, their smart district, has the clause in it that it can't be used to displace any existing residents. So it can't, the idea is that it will be a kind of testbed district, but it can't displace or gentrify. Now, in reality, that will happen because I suspect they'll find it quite difficult at a kind of a policy level to stop it happening. But at least they're aware that it's likely to happen, and they might try and do some intervention. Whereas in other cases, it's very explicitly about dispossession and displacement.
Yeah, I see that there are other questions. I forgot to say that, to remind, as the organizer told me, that the people the people that want to attend also the closing address have to stay a bit longer in the lobby for the announcement of the next conference. That I think will give us a few minutes more to discuss and to also to address a few questions that appeared here, one from Mateusz Mafra and the other one from Marilena Prisco. I think Mateusz are you able to get the floor, or Marilena? Otherwise, I will do the question. Probably I will start with Marilena, because Ayona first was mentioning the issue of vulnerability of the people that you actually interact with, and so the question was about how to create this safe space, also in terms of privacy, and probably was related to a methodological question in terms of how to create a safe space of research for the people, especially women.
Thanks, Marilena. I read your question and I thought, what a great question, because that's the part that I couldn't actually talk about. So you've given me the opportunity to talk about it. But this was also very, very significant, the question of ethics and anonymity. We started with, like any university project, making everything anonymous. And it became very clear to us very soon that the women didn't want anonymity, because they were, again, like I was mentioning before, they were speaking their stories, and they wanted recognition for speaking their stories, for being able to come out and talk about their life's experiences. So this went on. It was fine with the WhatsApp diaries, because anyway, it was a closed space and they didn't want necessarily what was being said in the WhatsApp diary to go out. So that's why you see the image of the selfies. We had to put, we got a graphic artist to put different faces on the actual places so it couldn't get recognized. But when we made the rap song, after it was recorded, we had no plans of making a video. We made the rap song, it was recorded, and we had this workshop, and we called all the women there and we played it. And then they started saying, where is the video? And we said, well, we had no plans of making a video. And they said, well, if we don't have a YouTube video, how are we going to be famous? And so really that's how it started. And it was a very quick turnaround in which I had to put in an amended application for ethics in order to make their faces visible. But I think this is where we really need to understand ethics also as contextually, politically situated, because it was something that was so intimately about themselves. They wanted to be there speaking these stories, despite a number of restrictions on them. And in fact, when we were filming, it was within the community. Many of them would say, I don't want to go into that street and film because some neighbor is there, some extended relative is there. And we would always have these discussions, how do you feel about not filming there, but when actually the video is on YouTube, they will see it. And at that point they said, well, it doesn't matter because then it'll be out. I don't want them to come in and stop this whole filming by creating problems. So it was really, really interesting. And you can go on our website. We've written several blogs about this whole process, about how slowly the anonymity was taken out, not necessarily as a breach, but as a resistant potential, as a way of speaking back again through their face, to give face to those voices. And then in the end, when the video was uploaded on YouTube, many of the women actually came to us and they said, well, initially my father was so against it, and I saw him actually sharing the link on WhatsApp to his extended relatives in the village. So the parents were proud of it. And this is often to do with, videos, because videos are seen as something, something impure, women sort of performing Bollywood songs. But most of their families accepted it after it was uploaded, because they said, oh, you're doing great work. You're talking about your struggles. You're talking about the struggles of this colony. It was very different. And again, I think we have to understand this toolkit as very situated. In another context, maybe they wouldn't want to show their faces. And in the podcast, we didn't show their faces. We did have the voices, but we obviously can't show their faces. But we also didn't mention the names of these women because it was not particularly possible. But the rap song, certainly, they wanted to show their face. And that's why then they were invited. They did so many interviews to media as well as a result of that. And they really reveled in that limelight.
Yeah. Well, a lot to think about and to reflect upon. I'm sorry we came at the conclusion on this great joint plenary. I want to thank you again, Professor Rob Kitchin and Professor Ayona Datta, for so much inspiration. And I wish you good evening and good holiday in some cases, and good work, of course, for your endeavor and project. I will close here the plenary, and a big shout out. Unfortunately, it's not possible with the collective audio, but I'm sure that the crowd is giving it now. Yeah, I see from the chat. And thank you again, and see you soon for the next session and the next closing session with Professor Sten Osterling and Professor Talia Blocken.